Hello everyone! Today we're going to be reviewing a Call of Cthulhu scenario, and that scenario will be from the Keeper's Rulebook. There are two scenarios that come in here. One is Amidst the Ancient Trees, and the other is Crimson Letters. Today we're going to be covering Crimson Letters. I think it's the stronger of the two scenarios, but it is also the more difficult to run. The nice part about Crimson Letters is that if you are running Call of Cthulhu, the Keeper's Rulebook is a product that you probably have. So it is a scenario that you do not have to spend any more money to acquire. And it's also a scenario that is an open world kind of scenario. So rather than following a linear plot, the scenario simply details a number of locations, as well as a number of NPCs. And the scenario revolves around a murder that occurs prior to the beginning of the scenario, or it appears to be a murder. What it actually is, the players will have to find out. So the premise of the scenario is that a professor of colonial history, Professor Leader, has been found dead in strange circumstances in his locked office on campus. It has also emerged that the Arkham Witch Trial papers, which Professor Leader had been assessing for the university, have mysteriously gone missing, unaccounted for. So the players are retained by the university, specifically Dean Bryce Fallon, to figure out, first of all, where these papers are, and second of all, to return those papers to the university before there's a scandal. In the process of looking for these papers, the players are going to meet all kinds of interesting characters and probably get to the bottom of what actually happened to Professor Leader. Now, if you're looking to play in this scenario, you're going to want to pause the video here, send your keeper this way because there's going to be spoilers from this point on. But keepers, stay tuned. I'm going to break down how I think are good ways to approach this kind of sandbox style scenario. All right, keepers. So the first thing to note here is, as I alluded to, this is a pretty open concept sandbox style scenario. This makes it a lot harder to run than a lot of the scenarios you're probably experienced with, just because you're not given a culprit for who took the papers. You have to establish that yourself and figure out ways to seed a sufficient amount of clues without simultaneously making it too obvious who the character was. And you also aren't given a list of predetermined events or scenes that occur in a set structure. Rather, you're given some location descriptions and a cast of NPCs who are going to react to the players when they come to investigate them or observe them or what have you. Of course, the NPCs are going to be doing their own things behind the scenes. Largely, they're going to be doing pretty banal things, but a few of them have some interesting activities they'll be up to. Because this is a scenario that you have to flesh out yourself, and there's no scenes you can fall back on, there's no predetermined plot you can rely on, there's not really a linear structure, this is a much more challenging scenario to run than most of the scenarios you will probably have run to this point. And I would certainly not recommend the scenario for a new keeper. You're going to want to get your hands on the starter set, probably. You're going to want to get your hands on some of the free scenarios that Chaosium has available. And you're also probably going to want to run Amidst the Ancient Trees from the Keeper Rulebook first. Another resource that's worth mentioning is Doors to Darkness as well. There's new keeper-friendly scenarios in there that are much more linear and fleshed out than Crimson Letters. So be warned, this is a challenging one to run. That said, it's also a very rewarding scenario because it's a little more reactive to the actions of your players. And from a player perspective, I think that's quite enjoyable. Knowing that you're actually not on some sort of linear path as you might be in Dead Man's Stomp, that you're not getting railroaded into any scenes, and that you are actually free to go and do whatever you want on your own initiative, and the world is going to react to you, and events are going to be affected by the actions your character is taking, and in no way is any of this predetermined. So yeah, just be warned, it's a little trickier to run. But it does give you a lot of resources to help with that. So first, let's discuss the characters. So the scenario gives you a number of characters to inhabit this world, to serve as potential suspects, and to offer the characters the necessary information they're going to need to track down all the leads and come to the conclusions that will allow them to recover the witch trial papers and deal with what's going on. And what is going on is that Professor Leader, the dead man, who is the genesis for the scenario, was involved in some shady activities, amassed substantial gambling debts, and accordingly, he needed to make some money. He decided that the witch trial papers represented a good way to make this money if he could auction them off. He deemed them valuable. He deemed them of occult interest to people, and he was generating a lot of interest from mysterious, kind of shady and potentially dangerous bidders who are unnamed in the scenario, but who you can, if you have scenarios you wish to run in the future with, potentially big dangerous organizations or, big dangerous mythos villains, these people could be those bidders. So the scenario offers a good way to seed your future scenarios if you're the kind of keeper who likes to plan further ahead. But yeah, so Leader had a bunch of bidders, and he got greedy, and he decided he would forge the witch trial papers, and that he'd just sell them to numerous bidders, and he would just collect all that money for basically forgeries of the papers. He retained one of his old students who flunked out of school to do this. The student is Cecil Hunter. He is an NPC who the players can interact with, but as Cecil began to forge these papers, he was copying, symbols he should not have been. And in the course of doing so, the creature that was contained within the symbols began to kind of break loose a little bit into the world. This caused Cecil to go mad, and it also caused strange occurrences to start happening around Professor Leader, who increasingly grew crazy to the point where he wanted to flee town. He was preparing to do so when the horror, the creature from the papers, found him in his office and tried to possess him. Leader, realizing what was happening, looked into his mirror, which basically shattered and liquefied in a strange way as he stared directly kind of at the creature and basically burned away his soul. So his body is found with a horrified look, kind of frozen onto its face, and he's found in his locked office. So it's a nice hook to this scenario. What it also means is that you need to figure out who stole the papers and when the papers were stolen. Were the papers stolen by someone who found Leader in his office after he was already dead, or were they stolen before that? You're going to have to determine which way you go. A number of the characters represent good culprits for the thief. A number of them do not, but have other uses in the scenario. The scenario details role-playing hooks, information about all of these characters. They're all really nicely fleshed out. And for the purpose of this review, I think the best thing I can do is just give you my input on what I think good uses for these characters are, and that may or may not be of use for you in adjudicating how to employ these characters in your own game. The first character, Professor Leader, is dead. He's found in his office, not by the players. They're going to have to go to the morgue to look at his body. And yeah, the state that his body's in is interesting. So just play up on that as your characters interact with it. The next character, and the character who introduces the players to the scenario, is Dean Bryce Fallon. He's kind of a no-nonsense kind of character who wants results, who wants to preserve the university's reputation, and who isn't willing to sacrifice the reputations of the investigators or pin the blame on them to preserve the university if they fail him. He's an interesting character. He's a good source of information. Your players are going to get information on leader, obviously, but he is also going to offer them information on Amelia Court and Harland Roach. These are the other two academic characters presented as NPCs in the scenario, and both are useful sources of information and also potential culprits. So just remember, as you're introducing the investigators to the scenario, be sure to have Fallon mention these characters and mention why they are relevant. So Amelia Court was the one who found Leader and was his research assistant working on assessing the papers. And Harland Roach was a fellow academic, a personal rival, and was also known to have been interested in the papers. So just make sure that you're giving your players those leads to follow up on. Because both of those characters, no matter how you're running the scenario, are characters that you're going to want your players to interact with. What I would do is use Fallon for those purposes. I wouldn't make Fallon the thief of the papers. I think that doesn't make a great deal of sense as he's written, and even if you modify him to make him some sort of evil character, making the person who hires the characters the scenario villain and then sending the characters off into a scenario full of NPCs who have strong motivations to have stolen the papers is probably going to be too confusing for your players. They're probably not going to be able to solve it. So just be wary of going down that route. I would just use him as he appears to be. He's the dean. He wants to protect the university's reputation, and he will do what he needs to do that. The other potential use for Fallon is if your players recover the papers quickly, you can use Fallon to signal that it's not the end of the scenario. So they're probably going to return the papers to him. They're probably not going to fully understand what's going on with the papers if they recover them very quickly. So strange things can start happening to Fallon. Fallon can contact the players and ask them to look into these really creepy things that are now happening to him and seem connected to the papers. That can get the players engaged again into the scenario and make them realize, oh, we actually kind of only solved the first and less important part of what's going on here. And you can also, if necessary, kill him if you really need to reinforce to your players that the scenario is not over, or if your players are following up on the mystery and they're not proceeding fast enough. So that's Fallon. The next character is Harland Roach. Harland Roach is introduced by Fallon. If the players speak to Amelia Court, she can basically confirm what Fallon has told them about the terseness of the relationship between those two characters. And Harland Roach is an interesting character. He's kind of like a slimy individual. He doesn't have very strong social skills. And it's also well established that he hated Leader. He has multiple motivations for having taken the papers. One, because he was interested in them for his own career, so he could have taken them before Leader's death. But he also hated Leader and perhaps wanted to destroy Leader's reputation, so he could have taken them after Leader's death, when he and Fallon went to look around the home and realized that the papers were missing. In fact, the papers could have been in Leader's home, and Roach pocketed them before Fallon saw them, leading Fallon to assume the papers were missing, and Roach to falsely confirm that, oh, I didn't see the papers either. Leader must have done something with them. That said, Roach is a very obvious suspect to have stolen the papers. He has a very strong motivation to have done so, and he also had the opportunity to do so. So he's someone your players will probably look into right away. So if you're wary of choosing a character who's too obvious, I think Harland Roach is the most obvious suspect. He had both the opportunity and he has one of the strongest motives to have done so. Nevertheless, if you play Roach as he's written in the scenario, he's going to be a delightfully unpleasant character. And it should be fun to kind of have your players interact with him. They're probably going to hate him. And it can be fun to see if that interferes with their judgment in relation to whether he's the suspect. And it colors their kind of perceptions of other characters based on the information they've given them about Roach. Like, for instance, this might make them trust Amelia Court more. She probably does not have positive things to say about Roach. It might make them more favorably inclined towards Leader, even as they learn about his less savory aspects, and just make him a little bit more sympathetic of a victim to the players. And of course, then there's Fallon as well. Harland Roach hates Fallon because Fallon gave the task of assessing the papers to Leader, his rival. So you can have Roach be trying to undermine Fallon, be spreading malicious rumors about him, but only if he's convinced the players aren't gonna go right back to Fallon and tell them, because he is also scared of Fallon. So there's lots of fun dynamics with Roach. And if you want to go for a more straightforward scenario, he's a pretty good culprit. The next character I'm going to discuss is Dr. John Wheatcroft. He's a kind of part-time faculty member in the Department of Medicine. He was the former coroner for the city of Boston. He's now retired. His heart's a little bit weak, which is probably going to become relevant over the course of the scenario. And he's been growing disturbed by kind of the strange things going on in the morgue where he's been keeping Leader's body. He's a fun character to kind of play up his paranoia, his dwindling sanity, if your players go to look at Leader's body, and presumably they will. You can really use him to help create a creepy atmosphere. The scenario does also allow for Leader's body to be used by the horror while in the morgue. Definitely don't do this the first time the players go there. It's pretty probable your players will go to the morgue more than once, especially if they interact with the Atlantic City Hoods or Lucy Stone. So I would save that manifestation for the second time the players go there. And if you play the first interaction in the morgue properly, they're going to be going there with some degree of dread, because they know it's a creepy place. It seems to be having an effect on the guy who works there. And, it's just something's not right there. And that should add to the horror of if you do decide to go ahead and have the horror manifest in Leader's corpse. Another thing to remember is that Wheatcroft has a frayed sanity and a weak heart. So seeing a corpse get up and walk around the morgue when he's already insanely stressed and paranoid about the strange things happening there is probably going to be too much for his heart. And you can have him have some kind of heart attack, or you can have him collapse. And that'll be an incentive for the players not to just run away and leave him with this thing. So if your players are the type who just bucket at the first sign of danger, that's something you can do, and you can, dock them a little bit of sanity if they just run and leave this poor elderly man having a heart attack in the morgue with a strange manifestation of a dead body. What I would not do is use Wheatcroft as the culprit, because there's no reason for him to have stolen the papers, and I don't really think your players will ever figure out that he is the culprit if you make him that, because he doesn't have strong ties to the other NPCs, he doesn't have strong ties to Leader, he doesn't have a motivation to have been interested in the papers. So yeah, I would steer clear of that route. I would use him to build up the atmosphere in the morgue, and then to potentially give your players a reason to stay there while the leader body rises. The next character we'll discuss is Anthony Flinders, and Anthony Flinders is an undergraduate student. He kind of presents as a kind of wealthy but charming and engaged student. But if the players look into him, they realize that he doesn't really have any friends. No one really seems to know him that well. And his interactions with them are a little bit odd. I think a great way to use Flinders is to have him kind of approach the players early on. Have him kind of present himself as a normal student, have him present himself as being concerned about the rumors he's been hearing going on, and he just wants to lend his assistance. And he'll keep his ear to the ground and let the player characters know if he hears any rumors about what might be going on. And your player characters are either going to take him up on that offer, or they're going to think this guy's weird and kind of look into him further. And both of those are good outcomes, because Flinders is very weird. Flinders is actually more than weird. He is a Satan worshiper, and he believes that if he can get his hands on the papers, he can use them in some sort of invocation to the devil. Flinders has no friends, and he's not shy about breaking the law to kind of get what he wants or silence those he thinks stand in the way of his interests. Of course, don't make this overtly obvious to your investigators. Play Flinders as a engaged but kind of slightly off character. As your players interact with him, it should become increasingly clear something is a little off with him, but it shouldn't be obvious what it is. You should also have Flinders feed them little bits of truth hidden in the context of lies. For example, in my game, Amelia Court had the witch trial papers, and accordingly, the horror was manifesting where she lived. Flinders told my players that he knew Amelia was up to no good, and he'd followed her home, and he saw all sorts of strange lights coming from her apartment, and that she must be a witch. Now, obviously, that's probably going to sound delusional to your players, although it is called Cthulhu, so it might not. They might take that at face value. But what it is going to do is you can hide all these crazy statements, and of course, don't just have him present one. Have him present all kinds of accusations about multiple people, all of them slightly laced with truth. So have him spread some kind of rumor that Fallon is up to no good and he only looks out for his own interests, and he had leader offed. And, a lot of that isn't true, but it is true that Fallon only looks out for his own interests. And if your players start looking into Fallon, they'll probably be able to confirm that's true. So by putting little bits of truth into these lies, you can make them a little bit more credible and make Flinders' stories and Flinders as a character a little more confusing to your players, which is good. You can also have Flinders lead your players to the culprit if they're having trouble finding them, because Flinders is, of course, still interested in procuring those papers. And if your players realize there's something off about Flinders, maybe he's actually figured out what's going on. He hasn't told the players, and he just goes to, steal the papers from whoever has them, or murder whoever has them and take the papers from them. And he could lead your players to the papers if they wise on to him. Of course, you can use Flinders as the thief. I think he has a less overtly obvious motivation for taking the papers, but once your characters begin to research and understand Flinders, he does have an obvious motivation. So he's not going to be super confusing. Wait, it was him? Provided your players look into him. I think he represents a good choice for the culprit, but I think there is a better one, and I'll get to that subsequently. But yeah, Flinders is a really fun character. He should be a pretty memorable one to your players. He's just once they kind of figure out that that he's up to no good and they confront him about it, you can really play up that kind of his Satan worshipping and that he's completely deranged, and he can try to stab one of them in the name of Satan or something. Maybe he's got all kinds of strange Satanistic markings on his walls, or decorating his apartment in some way. So yeah, Flinders is a really fun character. You can really use him to enhance the atmosphere of the scenario, misdirect your players if you think they're having too easy a time, or even employ him as a not super obvious, but not completely out of left field culprit. I think Flinders is a really good character. Next is Lucy Stone. She was romantically involved with Leader. She's a waitress at the Hibbs Roadhouse, and she's another character you can use in a variety of ways. Obviously, she's going to serve as a means to inform the players about the less reputable aspects of Leader's life, his gambling, his kind of criminal behaviors. She was privy to all of that. If your characters are able to convince her to divulge that, she can fill them in on that. Because without meeting her, or without finding clues in, say, his cottage, or figuring out his connection to Cecil, your players are really only going to know about his more reputable activities as an academic. So Lucy Stone's really good for that. She's also good as a way to introduce the characters to Oakes and Shaughnessy, the hoods from Atlantic City. They can be after her because they've been sent to look for Leader, and not finding Leader. They know that she's connected to him, so they are maybe going to be roughing her up. They're maybe going to be disappearing her. They're maybe going to be taking goods from her to pay down parts of Leader's debt. And she can be a good way to introduce those guys. There are other ways to introduce those guys, and I'll discuss them when I get to those characters. But she's well connected to those two. She's further a way to emphasize the dangers of the horror. You can have her have handled the witch trial papers, like maybe Leader got her to bring them to Cecil. Maybe he showed them to her in his office, and if you use her as a victim, and either in front of the players in some sort of horrific way, or off screen, and they find out that she too has died in some strange way after they've talked to her, that can be really effective in kind of building the horror throughout the scenario. She can also die of more mundane causes. She can be disappeared by the hoods. She can be murdered by Flinders. There's a lot of potential ways you can employ her. Just see what might work the best for your game, based on what's going on, and based on what the preferences of your players to be, just in terms of subject matter. You do also, I don't believe the scenario gives this, but I don't think she's at all an unreasonable choice to have stolen the witch trial papers. She could have gone to Leader's home after it was reported he was dead, got there before Fallon and Roach, and knowing that there was some sort of bidding war going on for these papers, she could have taken them, hidden them, and wanting to make a quick buck and then get out of town now that her lover is dead. She could be either sitting on them, or she could be getting into danger with other parties who want to get their hands on those papers. I think she's a strong choice for a culprit if you want to go that route. On the topic of things that could happen to Lucy Stone, let's get to Oakes and Shaughnessy. They're there as hoods from Atlantic City. They're obviously probably not at least the first culprit, because they're there looking for Leader, and actually they're convinced he's alive, and he's faked his death. He's hiding out because he had massive debts to the mob, and he knew something no good was coming his way. So you can introduce these guys to your players. Maybe looking around the Hop House mansion is a good option if your players go there. You can introduce them to your players through the Hibbs Roadhouse. Maybe they're keeping an eye on Lucy Stone. Maybe your players kind of arrive to see them kind of taking Lucy Stone out the back. Looks like something no good is going to happen. You can even have them poking around Leader's cottage or even in Leader's office or something like that. Basically, just introduce these guys partway through the scenario once your players have some kind of idea what's going on. And now you've got these guys here just, they don't believe Leader's dead. They're creating a ruckus. They're kind of just fun mobsters to play as. And you're going to create all kinds of fun interactions if they're confronting the players and saying like, we know Leader ain't dead. Where is he? And maybe your players are going to have to take them down to the morgue to say like, look, the body's here. He is dead. And then the body like manifests through the horror, and now you've got this horror scene, and the hoods don't know what's going on, but it ain't right. You can just use them as simple like goons if your players kind of enjoy the like, oh, we got to talk to Lucy Stone, and these hoodlums are making off with her. We gotta intervene so they don't hurt this lady because first of all that's not good, but second of all we need her for information. So these guys are just really fun characters. There's a lot of ways you can throw them into the scenario. Just don't throw them in too early before your players have established who the important characters are and have acquired some clues. You don't want to overcomplicate things too much right at the start. Speaking of complexity, Abner Wick is a very complex character. Abner Wick is a degenerate ghoul who is masquerading as a gentleman antiques dealer. He had a relationship with Leader. Leader had in the past sold him some antiques on the side, he's acted as a fence for Leader and other criminal elements. He also was interested in acquiring the witch trial papers. He will arrange a dinner, which is a fun little scene with the players, where he kind of talks to them about how he hears that they were retained to find the papers. How he is, very interested in this matter, how he's willing to assist them, how perhaps it could be arranged to sell him the papers. They aren't all that valuable anyway. He can also disclose to the characters that, the price in this bidding war got too high, but he was retained by some clients who he can't really talk about, but they're people best not meddled with. To act as a local kind of negotiator on their behalf. As I mentioned earlier, you can seed future villains into the campaign in this manner. And then conversely to this, if your players realize there's something strange going on with the papers and they haven't figured out any way to stop it, you can have Wick approach them and say, I know how to deal with the strange occurrences going on here, and I can stop them, but you'll need to give me the papers. So that can be a good kind of problematic way out for your players. It should be obvious that Wick is at least slightly off and may not be trustworthy, but they may have to turn to him in the absence of a better option of their own creation. So I think that's a really nice thing to present your players with if they do run into kind of trouble figuring out how to get rid of the horror, how to get rid of the strangeness associated with the papers, even if they have figured out where the papers themselves are. Finally, you can use Wick as the culprit. He obviously does have strong motivation. But I would advise against this in an ongoing campaign. And that's because Wick being a ghoul, Wick having two servants, quasi-employees, who are also ghouls who work at his antiques shop, is going to make it a pretty deadly environment to force your players to go poke around in and look for the witch trial papers if they suspect, and you give them reason to suspect that Wick has them. In particular, if you send your players down into the basement, the scenario itself notes that is a death trap. If you're running this as a one-off or one-shot scenario, definitely go with Wick. It's the way you're going to maximize the kind of horror sequences you're going to fit into the scenario and ensure everyone has an amazing time if they're comfortable with their characters dying, and it's a one-shot, so that's fine. The problem with that idea is that the Keeper's Rulebook, and I think this is a huge detriment to the rulebook, does not come with any pre-generated characters. And that makes running this scenario as a one-shot less appealing, because your players are going to have to go through the process of creating a character with a backstory relevant to at least Arkham, but actually probably this scenario itself. And if they go through that process, which is not a short one, it's not something you can do in 15 minutes if you're putting any degree of effort into it, they're going to be a little more upset if you force them into some sort of death trap where they have to fight 3 ghouls in a dark basement that they didn't have a good reason to foresee this kind of dangerous attack happening. Of course, if you do decide to go ahead and use Wick as the culprit, I think it would be fun to keep the dinner scene. So you can have him go and meet with the investigators, and maybe the investigators have got some clues that maybe Wick might be the guy they want to see, but he can just be lying to their face, oh, I'm very interested in acquiring the papers. I'd be willing to pay very well. And it can kind of like deflect from the fact he has them, and you can see if your players can see through this deception. And I think that's a fun scene, whether Wick has the papers or not. That leaves Cecil Hunter. Cecil Hunter is in the asylum, but by the time your players get to him, they're probably going to have some idea that something not good is going on with the papers, and they're probably going to want to ask him questions. I don't have much advice for playing Cecil Hunter other than to use the answers to varying questions that the scenario provides, because they're very well written, they're very atmospheric, and they're going to really contribute to the horror of your game, while also completely being in character for Cecil as an insane person who has seen too much of what's going on. And that leaves one character. And that is the character that I used as the culprit, and that is the character who I think is best used as the culprit, especially if you're playing with experienced players. That character is Amelia Court. Amelia Court requires a little more work than the others for her to make sense, but I think she's an excellent choice, and I'm going to explain why. First, about Amelia. Amelia is a postgraduate student. She's a female student in the 20s, and she was Dr. Leader's research assistant in assessing the witch trial papers. Already you have a very interesting character in terms of a female doctoral student in the 20s. Clearly she's very talented. Clearly she's going against widespread societal conventions. And clearly she has good knowledge about the papers and about a lot of the academic characters that the players will interact with. Add to that the fact that she's written as a wealthy character who has chosen to not use her wealth to her advantage, but to try to make her name through hard work and merit, makes Amelia an exceptionally interesting character. And the scenario completely ruins this promise of her as a character by presenting 2 completely unsatisfying dichotomies for her use. You can either use her just as a source of basic information. I found Dr. Leader dead. Dr. Roach doesn't like him, so on and so forth. And then she's effectively out of the scenario. She's just there to relay basic information at the start to your characters. And that's a complete waste of such an interesting character. Or, conversely, the scenario can just have her, she's actually an interesting woman because she's a witch, and she stole the papers because she's a witch and she's evil. And that is deeply unsatisfying as well. First of all, it's just missing all the underlying interesting features about her as a normal character. And second of all, it's going to be difficult to seed enough clues for your players for her to understand that she is a witch and that she's evil and that she took the papers. I also think it's a very uninteresting concept that a witch became a PhD student and then stole the papers because she's evil, because she's a witch. And yeah, just go get the papers from the evil witch. It just reduces all interesting aspects of her character and all interesting aspects of what could have motivated her. What I would really recommend and what the scenario should have done is have the option for Amelia to have stolen the papers as a concerned history student, which she is. She's very serious, she's very dedicated to her studies, and it is explicitly said in the scenario that she understands that Dr. Leader was engaged in some suspicious activities. She had evidence of this. She didn't have a strong relationship with Dr. Leader. And I think it is wholly plausible that Amelia, who had access to Leader's office, could have one night gone into the office, taken the papers to ensure that Leader didn't, sell off an important historical artifact, misuse an important historical artifact. She had reason to believe he would. And she can just have taken the papers for safekeeping, to protect what she perceives as an important artifact, to protect potentially the university's reputation as well. And she's done so at risk of her own reputation because she is a woman in academia. If she is accused of stealing these important papers, that could mean the end of her career. So obviously she's not going to immediately disclose to the characters that she stole the papers, because she has no reason to. So what you have then is Amelia as a character with good intentions that are consistent with her interesting backstory, in possession of the papers for good reasons, but reasons that are inimical to the investigators quickly finding them. So in this context, though there are many villains in the scenario, the papers were not stolen by a villain. But nonetheless, the investigators are going to have to figure out through clues that Amelia has the papers. You can seed those. You can seed them through like ramblings of Flinders. You can seed them through very obvious things as well. Remember, Amelia is the only one, just emphasize, Amelia and Leader were the only ones who had keys to that office. And if in interviews with, say, Cecil, you emphasize that after the initial forgeries were done, the papers were returned to the office, if you can do so in like a rambling, insane way. Obviously, don't just have him say that outright. But if you emphasize in some way that the papers were in the office, and there was never a record of the office being broken into, and Leader is dead, and no one thinks the papers were in his home, Lucy never saw them in his home, Lucy can also say he kept them in his office, then the only person who could have taken the papers is Amelia. And your players should be able to use deduction to figure that out. So her motive is not immediately obvious, but it is a strong one, and she had arguably the best opportunity to steal them. So I think she's an excellent suspect in that, or option to use as the thief for those reasons. Amelia is also another good option to use as the thief, because if your players are completely struggling to figure out what's going on, you can have Amelia come to them, because she's in possession of the papers. The manifestations of horror are now happening to her. Strange things are going on all around her. This is deeply unsettling. And if the players' characters have not been complete jerks to her or given her reason to suspect that they're involved in shady activities, and she thinks that these are upstanding characters who genuinely want to recover the papers for the good of the university, and she believes her life is at risk, she can tell them she has the papers and she needs their help. And that is not going to end the scenario. It's simply going to get the players to the papers and actually get to potentially the more interesting part of the scenario of figuring out how to stop the manifestations, before it starts eliminating characters with good motivations, such as Amelia, because it should immediately become apparent that Amelia took the papers for good reasons and that she is now a victim of her own good intentions. And I think that's a really strong way to kind of move towards the climax of the scenario and motivate your players to try to figure out ways to save her. So yeah, there you have it. There's the characters. The scenario also details some locations. A map is provided of Leader's Cottage. It's pretty handy. I dislike strongly that there are edges of handouts on that map. It means if you hand that map to your players right away, they're going to know there's some sort of relevant clue in there that they've got to look for. I don't know why Chaosium made the map like that. They haven't in subsequent products. Like stylistically, it immediately looks cool, but then you realize this is really annoying because I can't give this map to my players until they actually find the clue that has been overlaid onto the map. But you can use the map for your own reference as the keeper, so it's handy that that was included. Leader's Cottage is arguably the best described of the locales, and it's also the place with the most clues. You have clues relating to Leader's gambling debts. You have a lead to Cecil Hunter, his location, and you have leads to Lucy and Abner in there. Dean Fallon will give the players the keys to that cottage, so they definitely should be making it out there if they are investigating in a rational way. Leader's office is detailed. There's a few clues in there. There's leads to Hibbs Roadhouse, so ostensibly another lead or connection to Lucy to help the players figure out she's relevant. I also definitely recommend adding the casino chip option, which is listed as an option, and I don't think it should be. Just have like a casino chip or two kicking around like in a drawer of his desk. It's just going to foreshadow what the players are going to find later, and it's just a satisfying little hint about that kind of thing. The Hobhouse Manse is included with a very brief description. It's a red herring, but I like that it was included in the scenario. You can flesh it out further. It's as I've said, it's a good place to have Oaks and Shaughnessy poking around. Hibbs Roadhouse, I think should have been given a more detailed description. So just bear in mind you're going to have to flesh that out a lot yourself if your players go there, and they almost certainly will because there's multiple leads pointing them to Lucy, who works there, and there's no leads indicating where she lives. So that's where they're going to have to go to find her. So I think the scenario did not do the best job in that regard of fleshing out that locale. And then finally, you have Unconsidered Trifles, which is well detailed and which, as I've already mentioned, is a pretty dangerous location for your characters to have to poke around into. So I would try not to direct them there if you don't want to be killing them. But in a one-shot game, definitely try to get them there. Definitely try to guide them into the basement with clues something strange is going on down there, because there's definitely strong horror elements to the location. Just be wary of getting a player character who you want to keep alive for some future sessions into that basement, because that's potentially not going to work out well. Beyond that, the scenario kind of concludes by giving you a number of signs of passage or kind of ways in which the horror manifests itself over the scenario. These are all effective. They're all creepy. Employ them as you see fit, although I would say just remember to employ them only in locations with people who have touched the papers. So remember where the manifestations are happening is a clue, and your players can figure that out. So if you put a manifestation where it actually shouldn't have happened, you're going to misdirect your players. So just be very certain before you start the game about where the manifestations need to happen and when they need to happen. I would also say, as is always good advice, just build up the manifestations. Don't start with don't start going all out. Start with subtle manifestations, small hints something is not right, and build up. Because otherwise you're just setting the bar really high, and you're not going to be able to go higher than that. What you do after that is going to be less satisfying to your players. Finally, the scenario does include portraits of all the NPCs. They're reasonably well done, and I really do like that these were included, because they're the kind of things that you can provide to your players after they meet an NPC. You can give them the picture, you can show them the picture, and it's just going to help reinforce, oh, that is who this character is, that's what they look like. And I really like that it was done this way. I also really like, unlike in some of the scenarios in Doors to Darkness, the portraits are individual portraits. They're not all included together. So you don't have to spoil aspects of the scenario or show characters the players haven't met yet and don't know are relevant if you want to show a single portrait. You can just show them individually as you need to. That's really good. Normally, I kind of begin my conclusion by discussing my player's experience and thoughts on the scenario. I think that's less relevant here because it is a kind of open sandbox scenario that is really fleshed out and filled in by the keeper. And based on the choices that the keeper makes, the player experience is going to vary quite a bit. So it's going to be really impossible for you to replicate the game that my players had. So I don't think me telling you that my players enjoyed it is particularly useful, although they did enjoy it. They had a good time. But what I can do and what I've tried to do is show you what I think are effective ways to use the characters, and offer some advice on who I think are good characters to use in what ways. That said, in terms of Crimson Letters as a whole, I think it is a good framework. There's a plethora of really interesting characters you can use. They're all kind of shady or interesting. And it's not immediately obvious who took the papers, nor is it immediately obvious what is going on with the unnatural occurrences. I think the scenario can work really well for an investigative game. It can work at the same time. It will work really well for building up an unsettling atmosphere. But just be wary, again, as I said, as a keeper. This one's a little more complex to run, so don't run it at first. Build up your experience and build up your understanding of like what is working well, what kind of decisions do my players make, and that can inform the choices you make when you get to Crimson Letters, and then flesh it out for your group before playing. That's all I have to say about Crimson Letters. I think it's the better of the two scenarios in the Keeper's Rulebook, and I think it, in the right hands, is going to create a really fun game, and it's going to offer a number of memorable NPCs that your group will remember for a while to come, in particular Anthony Flinders. As always, if you've run this one, please share your thoughts in the comments section. Especially for this scenario, decisions that you made, your logic for making those decisions is probably going to be really helpful to people planning on running this. So really, the more people share their experiences and ideas about what kind of things work and don't work for this one, the better games people who are approaching this are going to be able to run, because they're just going to have a wealth of information to work from. If you agree, disagree with any of my suggestions, don't hesitate to add that to the comments as well. If you have any questions, please do let me know. And otherwise, I really hope this was useful for you all. I appreciate everyone watching, and I'll definitely be keeping the Cthulhu videos coming in the subsequent few days. So stay tuned for that. And until then, happy gaming.